All right, Mary, go ahead.
Thanks, Hannah. Hello, and welcome to our second webinar in the UT Global Supply Chain Institute's exclusive summer series for our Supply Chain Forum partners. My name is Mary Long. I'm the Managing Director of our Supply Chain Forum, and I'll start with a few housekeeping items and then hand it off to Wendy and Mary. Note that during the webinar, all attendees will be muted. The information that is on this slide will be copied into the chat, and if you need to reference it later, go there. We will use several live polls to give you all an opportunity to share timely perspectives with one another. Your poll responses will be anonymous, so please use the Q&A function on your Zoom control panel to submit questions for the panelists. If you have questions for our tech team, send them to the gsci@utk.edu email. After the webinar, you will get an email with links to the recording of this webinar and the slides. Okay, that's it for the setup. It is now my extreme pleasure to introduce our speakers for today. Two of our very own UT Supply Chain Management Department faculty, Wendy Tate and Mary Holcomb. Wendy serves as the Cheryl Massengale Faculty Research Fellow and William J. Taylor Professor in Business. Mary is the Gerald T. Nieder Professor and Martin and Jean Mills Faculty Research Fellow. They both bring decades of supply chain research experience and insights. I will now mute and disappear and come back at the end of the session.
Hello, everyone. You know, it's been a wild ride since early March. We've had acute shortages of items like hand sanitizer, wipes, personal protective equipment, and yes, even toilet paper has been front and center on multiple news outlets. But little has been talked about regarding an essential part of the supply chain, and that's about the suppliers and vendors. The smooth and uninterrupted flow of materials and finished goods through the supply chain to manufacturers and others is a critical role that these supply members play. So the focus of today's webinar is on the supply side itself. We're going to begin the presentation by talking about the current situation, and we're going to follow this with the more in-depth discussion of the factors that contributed to this current environment, even before COVID-19 was the topic of the day and it wreaked its havoc. Finally, we're going to close the presentation by offering some suggested action items as we continue to navigate this new abnormal situation. So in preparing for this webinar, I did a search in word count for the many descriptors that have been used to characterize this current status. So as you can see here, things like unprecedented and unparalleled were two of the ones that were used the most often in terms of terms. When you're in times of prosperity, what we find is it's very difficult to get a company to be engaged in change. After all, if you think about prosperity, it can generally be characterized as stability and we're prospering, and most people don't see a need to change or rock the boat if that's the case. Yet if you look at the size and the scope of our global supply chains, it's resulted in ecosystems that are resilient and fragile. Now note, I didn't say equal parts of those two characteristics. In fact, it took a global pandemic for us to expose the weak points, and it turns out that we had quite a few. We did a GSCI study where we reported that 47% of factories and distribution centers didn't have a backup plan. This was also followed by 51% of suppliers that said they could not supply within a reasonable time if a major issue occurred. So what that means is that in our current circumstances, if they're truly unprecedented, as global supply chains are not accustomed to dealing with the worldwide disruption, we really didn't have a pandemic supply chain playbook. And in fact, Wendy, if you go to the next slide, we were pretty good at responding to what I consider to be isolated or even regional supply chain disruptions, but we were totally unprepared for the coronavirus. Albert Einstein said, "In the midst of every crisis lies great opportunity. So applying this means that if we don't have a supply chain playbook, then we have to, I think, get busy and put one together so we know how to operate going forward. We need to be able to evolve, grow, learn, and improve to facilitate that long-term viability. One of the trends that we had begun to notice even before we had the COVID-19 was the shift from global to a more regional perspective. This operation really in a complex environment, it makes it very challenging for supply chains. This difficult business environment and the number of e-commerce sales that were happening, the e-commerce sales were increasing at double digits even before our COVID-19. And that double digits was year over year. So when we started having these stay-at-home orders and things, what we saw in terms of e-commerce is that it started increasing at an exponential rate. And so even now, as we're lifting some of those restrictions, we still see a large percentage of people that are continuing to rely really heavily on this method for purchases of things like groceries and other household items. Now, in case you've missed it, we have two companies, Amazon and Walmart, that have really been in a heated competition to fulfill these e-customer orders. And they're doing it in what they consider to be an ever-shrinking lead time. What we're expecting as consumers is that we're going to have this almost instant fulfillment that's going to happen. If you look at Amazon Prime and the 2-day deliveries that they've been able to do, that's been growing at a rate of about 30% annually. Now these two fierce competitors and others are working on doing next day and same day deliveries. This is going to put even more pressure on the existing network due to things like congestion. And this is the most expensive type of delivery that we can do. It's a high cost of doing this. So without major changes in how we distribute, it's going to be a real challenge for us to be able to do that. And last but not least, if we look at what's going on from a geopolitical thing, this whole move to local supply chains as well as regional has really in some ways been moved to that state simply because in August, well, it wasn't the beginning of it, but the whole tariff thing in August of 2019, Trump announced that he was going to impose a 10% tariff on about $300 billion worth of Chinese imports. And so in addition to that and the tariffs that we were trying to get accustomed to, and in the second quarter of 2019, we also had major trade pacts and agreements that were being negotiated as well. And so we began to see that impact as well in terms of what was going on. If we think about this whole idea of where we source from and where we manufacture, we have to really look at these value and non-value added tasks that we're going to do. We have to think about things like efficiency, and we have to look at the effectiveness of that, because after all, as consumers, we're looking for the best value and the best deal in terms of stretching our dollar as we spend it as well. And we had a question that was submitted for the seminar that asked that whether or not, if we thought the network restructuring post-COVID-19, do we see that actually happening? Or will China continue to be the predominant vendor for the US and European firms? We thought this would be a great time to get some input from you. And so we have a two-part polling question that we are going to ask you to participate in, if you would please. So let me make that live. So the first part of that polling question is, we want to ask you if you're manufacturing or sourcing of materials and components from China, or if you're still going to do that, or if you're planning to relocate. So we have a couple of answers here, yes, no, and some. And I'll wait a few seconds while everybody is getting their votes in on this particular one. And I'll do a countdown in just a few seconds as I see everything closing out. Okay, so let's do a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And I'm going to end that polling and I'm going to share the results. So we see some interesting things happening here. We see about 33% of you say that yes, you are planning to relocate either manufacturing or sourcing of materials and components. We have 24% that said, no, you're not going to, but by and large, the biggest percentage of you say you're going to be moving some of that sourcing and or manufacturing. Wendy, was there anything about these results that surprised you, or comments that you might have about that?
No, actually, it was sort of what I expected, because I think it would be really expensive to all of the sudden pick up and move out of a certain geography. But I think there needs to be more geographic diversity that we look at as, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, but I'd be really curious. So those that are moving and those that some of you are moving, I'd like to know where you're going. So maybe you could launch that next poll.
We certainly will. And so if I go back to polls, let's see, then we are going to go to our second question here. And that's exactly what we're going to ask. Where will manufacturing or sourcing relocate? And you'll notice here that we have multiple choices, and please check all that apply. You'll notice that hopefully that we've covered all of the selections that are going to be relevant, like US and Mexico, Eastern Europe. We also have Western Europe, Africa, Southeast Asia, India. And then again, just so we capture that group, we want to also see those of you from the previous slide that don't have any relocation planned. So we'll wait for a few seconds or for those results to come in. The second question that was asked in terms of this relocation also had to do with, where, not in addition to where we see it relocating, but also what industries we think will be some of the first that are going to be involved in this movement. Okay. So I'm going to do my countdown now. So if you haven't gotten your vote in, please do. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And so I'm going to end the polling and I'm going to share the results. So if we look at that, the large majority of you are planning to do some relocation of manufacturing and or sourcing to the US and Mexico. About 73% said that they were going to do that. About 50%, which is the next largest percentage, said that you were going to relocate to Southeast Asia. We gave examples of like Vietnam and Cambodia. And then following that, Eastern Europe seemed to be the next largest geographic region for which we were going to have this relocation. Wendy, was there anything about these results that surprised you or are interesting to things that you'll be talking about?
Yeah, so probably about 5 years ago now, CSCMP wanted us to do some research on the idea of reshoring. It was one of those other times where they wanted to bring jobs back home. That was a political platform. So so when I thought about this and where things would go, the US and Mexico, I really did expect to see quite a bit of investment in the US and Mexico. So those results aren't surprising. And I've also had conversations with people located in Southeast Asia, like Vietnam, saying, we're here and we're ready to take some of this, the China production away. So I think we still are going to have to really think about that geographic diversity and how we might be able to better manage and mitigate risk. It's kind of like not this one size fits all process. We have to really think about our total cost, and again, I'll be talking more about that later. So I was a little bit surprised, but not completely surprised, that Africa didn't have anyone sign up, because in the CSCMP research that we did, that was one of the places that many organizations were looking as the next China. So that is an interesting result.
So let me make a correction here. The third area in terms of relocation was not Eastern Europe, but it was India. And I noticed that one. So let me make that particular change right now. So we've set the stage for the current environment, and now Wendy's going to take over, and she's going to lead the discussion on factors that contribute to our current supply situation, some of which existed before we were dealing with COVID-19. Wendy?
Yeah, so thanks, Mary. And and the audience needs to keep in mind that my whole being is about procurement. So most of my perspectives I look at, and I think about it from a procurement perspective. But I wonder sometimes how we got to where we are, and how did we get here today? And I think the term today is used kind of loosely. 3 months ago was very significantly different than actually today is. So things are changing, and changing at a very rapid rate. So we've got supply chain disruptions. We're very challenged to meet demands. We have product shortages even today in the stores. So lots of things are really, something we need to think about. But again, from a procurement perspective, I think part of the issue that has been driven by this cost obsession in our day-to-day jobs. And I understand that, completely understand it. I teach it. So, but cost cutting and cost reduction is always, always a goal. And those 3 to 5% year-over-year savings goals have really taken its toll on our overall supply chain health. And I'll explain some of that in a minute. And really put us in a position where we are sort of fragile, not more fragile than we are resilient. So the short-term cost and profit issues have really pushed us in an area where we are. We keep focusing on cost savings, however we can find those cost savings. We are always in pursuit of higher profits, and that is not a bad thing at all. We're in business to make money. That is a goal. We try to continue to increase our share prices. So focusing on this, bottom line cost reduction, and of course we always want those revenue increases as well, has really put us in challenging positions. And in some cases it's because of the practices we use to reduce these costs. And some of those are creating issues. And the first one that I want to talk about is this idea of misapplication of lean. And if Tom Goldsby's in the audience, he's going to probably send a question through any minute now. But lean, and I just read about a panel today, and they're having this panel at a conference called Euroma. And they said that, lean is going to basically save the world. And from my perspective, lean is a great way to reduce costs. And being lean is fantastic because we also, if we're reducing costs, we're reducing waste. So lean became very popular in the 80s and the 90s. It really encouraged this focus on reduced waste in all areas, defects and over processing and waiting and all these different areas. We started to look and say, we can be better here. But what happened really is part of it's due to this inventory issue where we said, if we know demand, then it's much easier to predict inventory and the appropriate inventory levels. But the minute that we don't know and we're not sure of demand, it's quite challenging to continue to reduce inventories. We need those buffers. And I realize that inventory is considered waste. Overproduction is also quite a bit of a problem, not having the right things being produced. We saw this with industrial products and then not enough having on the commercial side, we didn't have enough products. So it was just because of the huge variability in demand. So the problem today and why lean is an issue is that demand is so unpredictable. And so we have to be able to figure out and look at ways where we might be able to take back some of those lean processes and practices, or maybe not apply them so dramatically so that we can better react to changes in demand. So, and moving from there, and then the procurement people were another part of the problem, right? Another very big part of the problem. We focused so much on low-cost country sourcing. We went after all the lowest prices that we could possibly get. And even in in the real old days, when I used to actually have a different job than the academy, I worked for a furniture manufacturer, and my job was to outsource our manufacturing to manufacturers in China. So we were buying fully assembled furniture from Chinese manufacturers. I just gotten my MBA, and my boss said, I want you to prepare a total cost of ownership. What does this mean for us, and how can we impact our margins? And the first thing that I call it the supplier in China that we decided we wanted to use. And I said, okay, how much are you going to charge me? What's the price that I need to pay? And the response from this supplier was, how much are you willing to pay? And that it was not a shocking answer, really. And many people heard that. And so we had to think about, what is it that we were willing to pay? And, how could we take these total costs and, or how could we continue to reduce the total costs, even though, we had these prices and all these different cost elements coming in. So China saw, again, significant changes over time. We increased our distance, lengthened our supply chains. We had to buffer inventory somewhere. The low prices that we got, at least for periods of time, helped us to buffer these additional costs and these additional risks that were put in place as we started buying from the low-cost country areas. And as the supply chain grew longer, then we started to say, let's leverage. Another way to get cost out is to leverage volumes with fewer suppliers, which was another thing that we did. So we kind of took out some of that redundancy in our supply chain, but again, focus on the low price and the low cost. So we used fewer sources. We no longer had local sources that we could go back and visit. And we sort of lost some of the visibility that we had into the multi-tier supply chain. Do we know who the suppliers are of these organizations in China? And probably in most cases we don't. So other things that happened is we started to compete in factor markets. So instead of competing in product markets, we saw, these great shifts to go over to locations like, just for example, going and buying customer contact centers in India. Well, there were people that were the first movers. They took advantage of the talent and the labor pools. They trained them. And honestly, everyone said, great idea, let's all move over there. And then started to compete on trained labor in order to continue to have these operations. So we ran into kind of a different sort of rivalry than we were used to. So that's, the way that we were sourcing has caused some of this problem as well. So the other thing, and I sometimes just even hate to say this because I spend so much of my teaching efforts trying to get students to understand how to be financially literate so they can actually communicate to people in the organization. But we really started to fixate on financial statements. We wanted strong balance sheets. We wanted low inventories, as already mentioned. We wanted lots of cash. And so cash made us feel, cash is king. And so we thought that our cash conversion cycles were, the faster we could get them, the better off we were. We pushed inventory to our suppliers. We extended payment terms to our suppliers. And, we found ways to utilize somebody else's cash in the supply chain, which everything's fine until something goes wrong. And then we start to run into problems. So this sort of fixation, and again, I completely understand that this is something we need to do, but in these new times, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, I think we need to think about, inventory and payables and all of these other things that we've made great changes to in recent years. So Mary's going to come back now. We have another poll because we're kind of curious on this balance sheet and how you're going to handle inventory levels right now. So Mary?
So Wendy, one of the things that I saw as I continued to go to the grocery store, and I saw more and more shelves that were empty, and wondered where is that inventory, and yet many of the CEOs would come on the networks and talk about the fact that we didn't have a few food shortage, et cetera. And I kept thinking, we know that inventory is waste, but what are you planning? Is your company planning to increase inventory levels in the future? Because as Wendy said, it's very, very difficult now to be able to even forecast or look at demand management to try to determine what's going on. Are we through a lot of the panic buying, and when will that settle out? And so it's very interesting here if I'm seeing the results as they're coming in. And in just a few seconds, I'm going to do my countdown. So we'll take a look at those results. So let me do a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And I'm going to end the polling and share the results. Now, Wendy, this is an interesting one. So, you know, if we look at where firms are financially, I think there is a big crunch on many of them in terms of what they're doing. And as you said, inventory is one of the first areas that we look at in terms of being able to do some major cost cutting. And it appears that 55% of our participants today are really not planning to increase any inventory levels, while about 41% said that there are some areas for which they're going to add some. Any thoughts or considerations in terms of these results?
Yeah, so I'm really curious, and this might be a kind of an internal measure of increasing inventory levels. Our next question is actually going to ask you about different types of inventories, and so I'd like to see what these results show.
Okay, and so I'm going to, that question is up for you to look at. For those of you that said you were either, you know, there was some inventory increases that you were going to do, where are those increases or those buffers going to incur? We gave several choices here and we said, please check any and all that apply, whether that's going to be in your firm's raw materials and components, whether it's going to be in your finished goods. Are you going to ask your suppliers to increase their levels of raw materials and components? Or are you going to look at that middle person, that distributor and wholesaler, as being the area where you're going to ask them to hold a bit more inventory as we're working through this volatility? We'll give it a few more seconds in terms of people entering the results before we end the polling. So I'll do my countdown. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I'm going to end the polling and share those results. These are very interesting ones. So when we were preparing for this webinar, Wendy and I were working through lots of different scenarios in terms of the answers. I think, you know, through our research and other things, we have our ideas of what we're seeing and indications as we talk to lots of firms. One of the things that we thought, and is really the whole focus of this webinar, is about those raw materials and components. And as I said when I first started, one of the things that I thought was being left out of that discussion was that if we don't have the materials to make those finished goods, we're really going to be in much deeper trouble than we were. And it looks like about 42% of you said that that's where you're going to, in your firm, increase those materials. And that's followed by your finished goods as well. And then obviously the suppliers' raw materials and components. Wendy, was there anything about this, once again, that you found interesting or surprising in terms of those results?
I just think we're going to start seeing a shift of where we're holding our supply chains, or our inventory. And, you know, I'm not surprised that some people are definitely going to increase raw materials and finished goods within their own facilities. But it wouldn't surprise me either that we kind of ask our suppliers to buffer a little bit more on their side. Maybe they'll ask their suppliers to buffer a little bit more. And from a distribution center, I can see where that would be important. You know, I know even with some of our PPE equipment, supplies and the actual, you know, the equipment, they were in not necessarily the right places to get it to the customers when we needed it. So I sort of see this as being expected.
Okay. So if you would move to the next slide, Wendy, then just kind of summarizing this, this component of talking about, the factors that contributed to the condition or the state that we're in now. I think this captures, kind of what we've seen overall, and even from your input is indicated that what it means for the supply chain network is that we're going to probably look at a more decentralized system. We are going to be shifting and probably have a little less reliance on China. One of the sub-questions that was asked earlier attached to this relocation is what industry sectors do we see moving first? And I think definitely in terms of the apparel, and I think we saw that happen a little bit before as they started moving to India, Bangladesh, Vietnam, Cambodia, and some other countries. But I think one of the weak points that really came to light was the fact that in our medical and healthcare and pharmaceutical particularly, we are looking at that and trying to determine are the critical areas for which we definitely need to bring those back to the US or wherever we would in terms of being able to have that capability. COVID-19 really laid bare the challenges that companies are facing in providing what I would consider to be this real-time accurate visibility into where the goods are and when they'll be delivered. One of the other things that we saw is that we're looking at this diversification of supply sources and how things are going to ultimately get to that end consumer. Now, I thought it was really interesting, and I've done this already. PepsiCo is one of those companies that in addition to their normal distribution channels that they had, which would be the club stores, the grocery, and other areas, they stood up a new distribution channel that delivered directly to the consumers. So in addition to this B2B, business to business, and B2C, business to consumer, now we have this D2C, which is what we're talking about here in terms of this diversification. So PepsiCo had the pantryshop.com, and they had also the snacks.com where you could order these pre-assembled packages in terms of sending it directly. And so this diversification, I think they saw a business opportunity, and it's turned out to be a good one for them. Now Mondelez, because my other favorite snack food, which is Oreos, Mondelez is also offering that direct-to-consumer channel, and they're customizing the packaging. So these are just some of the ways in which we're seeing as we have that less reliance on China or even the distribution channels that we're using, that we're going to be doing that. Now, the direct-to-consumer strategy for brands and manufacturers, it bypasses that traditional retail distribution channels, as I said previously. It's going to really establish what previously wasn't these manufacturers really as the guardians of consumer experience. And in many cases, I'm wondering if we're really ready for that. What we're also going to see happen is that we're going to see this increase in disintermediation. And what we're saying is when we ask about the distributors and wholesalers in that previous question, if we're going more directly to the consumer, we know that there are going to be this middle layer, these middlemen that maybe not be adding the value that they did previously. But if we're going to go direct to the consumer, as we said before, and be responsible for that customer experience, we have to be successful, we have to really focus on these three things. We have to make sure that we have optimal and wide delivery coverage. I think in many cases, unlike what we've been doing in terms of business to business, we have to think about those increased service capabilities. What do we have to offer? What are the costs of that? And then, as I mentioned before, this increased tracking and visibility in terms of where orders are. Now, moving from here, Wendy's going to recommend some action items that we think are important as we move forward in these very unique times. Wendy?
Thanks, Mary. So no one can really say how long it's going to take us to recover from the COVID-19 recession. And we've heard it's going to be V-shaped or L-shaped or U-shaped or W-shaped, and nobody really knows. But I have just a few ideas or action items that maybe we can take that could help strengthen the weak or broken parts of the supply chain and maybe help us to prepare for whatever is going to come next, because we don't know what that is or when that is. So first, I have to take care of my suppliers and my supply base. They really, really need you now, and they really are struggling. I've heard many stories about how difficult it is for them to get orders out, lots of claims of force majeure, many issues happening, and they need you. So if at all possible, and maybe this will give you a little bit more buffer in your inventories, but keep buying from them. If at all possible, again, we have delayed payment terms out over 100 days, in many cases 120 days, and if there's a way to get them better payment terms, that will also be very helpful. They are having to pay for the supplies that they need to make your products, so we've got to keep them financially viable. What we learned from the recession actually was that when suppliers, if you take care of your suppliers, when things get better, they remember you. And it actually is helpful to be a customer of choice. If there are capacity constraints or other issues, and they remember you did them a favor, they will likely come back, and help you when you need help. So it's very important to keep those suppliers in business, because it's even harder if our supply chains continue to break, to have problems. So my next idea, and this we should be doing this anyway, but we need to understand our entire supply chain. We need to know who are our suppliers. We have a good handle on those first tier suppliers. When you get into tier 2 suppliers and tier 3 suppliers and even further, we don't often know who those people are in our supply chains, but they are introducing significant amount of risk, or could be, and we need to know where they're located, because one of my other contentions is going to be, we need to really think about geographic diversity, not just simply having a redundant supplier somewhere. So in 2011, we had something that they said nothing like this could ever happen. And there was a giant earthquake, and then that earthquake changed into a tsunami, and that tsunami then set off these nuclear reactions. And so it was a very big disaster, and it basically shut down Japan. And pre-earthquake, Toyota, they were looking, and they're pretty good at risk mitigation, and they were looking at their supply base, and what they thought they had was this pyramid structure. So they have more tiers than this, but I'll just show two. So they had tier 1 suppliers buying from different tier 2 suppliers, buying from different tier 3 suppliers, and so they thought they had actually done a really good job in mitigating risk, even though a lot of their suppliers were still located in Japan. So they thought they were working with this structure, and what happened was, and they found this out because of the tsunami, they really had this barrel structure in their network. And they end up going through, and they find out that tier 5, or someone way down the level, is all the suppliers are buying these microcontroller units from a single source. And so they were all, there was one point of failure in their network. And so that supplier, of course, was completely destroyed during the tsunami. And so what do you do? And, how was Toyota going to act? Because Toyota, they were in trouble. And so they did a lot of things. They ended up shutting down facilities for a period of time because they actually couldn't manufacture. But you have to think too, through these multiple tiers, do you have this pyramid structure where risk is a little bit more manageable? Or are you sitting in this barrel structure where there is or might be a single or 2 points of failure? So think about what your network looks like. And then, of course, try to develop a more resilient supply chain, trying to make it less vulnerable to disruptions. We, in procurement, we focused on having redundant suppliers. We were pretty good about knowing that sole sourcing was probably not the right thing to do. It was too risky. But then when we started to look at what the redundancy looked like, companies had both their primary and their backup suppliers in China. So anyway, geographic diversity is extremely important. And, you know, we learned this. So we need to think about this in terms of our COVID-19 as well. I'm going to make a suggestion, one that probably is not going to be well received, but think also about bringing some manufacturing capabilities onshore and in-house. And, you know, the reason for this is that we outsourced and we offshored all of these capabilities. So we lost the capability to develop our own products, to make our own products. And you know, I'm not even sure today with the students, if you said, well, you're going to go work in manufacturing, if they actually would want to work in manufacturing. But this will for sure mean more than low cost country sourcing. It's going to cost more, but I think it's going to pull a little bit of risk outside of your supply chains. And, you know, I have an example. I used to study services, and in the services industry, the best companies, because it was very risky to offshore to India, particularly in the early days of call center offshoring, they retained small groups of people within their organization that performed those jobs, so that if something did happen, then they could bring the jobs back home internally. And also it helped them to set some benchmarking standards for their suppliers. So so those were the companies that actually ended up in better situations when working with India in that case. So, you know, plan for unexpected disruptions. This is what we have a hard time doing. I even have a hard time thinking of what's the next thing that's going to happen. But disruptions that we never conceived of, they happen, and something will happen again in the future. Just in a brief example, we rarely have earthquakes in the middle of the United States, but from December of 1811 to March of 1812, there were over 2,000 earthquakes that occurred. 3 of those have the highest magnitude earthquakes that have ever been documented. And one was a magnitude of 8.1. One was a magnitude of 7.8. And the final one, they say it was as much as, and could have been more than 8.8. And if you think about that, I mean, in the 1800s, we weren't as developed as we are now. But looking at this shows the shock waves from this earthquake, and it really targeted just about all of our big cities on the East Coast. They felt these problems in Washington, D.C. and in Boston. And, you know, we would have lost a lot of suppliers and a lot of manufacturing plants during this time had they existed. But I don't think there's any belief that there's ever going to be another earthquake in this area, because I don't think that it's kind of like the unconceivable again. How could that ever happen? But it did happen. So for me, when we talk a lot about risk and thinking about how to deal with the unexpected. And even in my class, when I teach about risk, I teach the students, I say, you know, you need to think about risk in terms of the probability of something happening compared to the consequence on your business if it does happen. Okay, so now what I'm saying to you is don't think about the probability anymore, because something is going to happen. We don't know what that looks like today, but something will happen. So think about it as, what if something happens and one of my network, if this is a network of our suppliers, something happens to a particular node in our suppliers. And if you look and we just say that particular node gets pulled out of our networks because a country is shut down or whatever, that has a different implication than what's the probability of something happening, because just looking at that node that I have marked, it has many, many, many different connections. So just in general, and I know we want to have time for more questions, take care of suppliers, understand what your supply chains and supply networks look like, map more than just one tier of suppliers, look at geographic diversity, don't have redundant suppliers in the same location as your primary suppliers. Think about developing some capabilities in-house, and always, always, always plan for the unexpected. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mary Holcomb again to talk about sort of this new abnormal business environment, and then we will have time for questions.
Okay. Wendy, I hate to do this, but I'm going to put you on the spot because that's a really great list of action items. But most people would say, if we can't tackle all of them in terms of companies, are there one or two that you think are really of critical importance that if companies should start on today in terms of making sure that they could check that particular box?
Mary, I really don't have an answer to that. I think about this quite a bit, and I know, like, I just talked to a reporter the other day, and they were talking about all of the textile industry moving to the United States. And, even when I'm talking, I'm thinking we don't have the capability to manufacture textiles. So how is that going, what is that going to look like? But many people tell me, we're reshoring. The jobs that are being reshored are not the same jobs that left. It's going to be a lot more technology than we've seen before with robots and such. But I think we need to plan for at least some capabilities in many of our organizations.
Okay, thank you. So, as we're trying to figure out what this new abnormal business environment is going to look like, there have been a lot of trends that have emerged already in those 3 short months that have seemed like a lot longer time period than that. So we're going to see as we move through this COVID-19 and beyond that, what are some things that we think are going to be around? Well, the first one that we think is this move to a touchless society. Wendy's talked a lot about digital and that whole transformation of supply chains in terms of digitalization and how we're going to do everything from an end-to-end perspective. And in case you lose a sensitivity to this, I was at one of the club stores the other day, and as you leave and you're checking out, they want your receipt and they do a quick scan to make sure that you have what is shown on that receipt. And the person in front of me said to the person working at the club store, "Please don't touch my receipt." And she was really very nervous about the fact that this person would do that. And so this idea of the touchless society and what it's going to take in terms of that. So if we think about safety and convenience factors, I think that we have to think about, as we're going direct to the consumer, how we're going to facilitate really a lot of these things. Because with just a few mouse clicks, screen taps, a growing number of people are buying just about anything that they want from anywhere around the globe. And so I think we have to be ready and prepared for that to happen. Now, the second thing, when we talk about this idea of competitor, partner, or both, we really are going to need to do some cross collaborations. It's not just in the medical field where they're working together really in a combined or coordinated fashion to try to find a vaccine. I think we need to do this in terms of our supply chains and just really developing best practices and how we're going to get to the other part of this itself. I mean, if you think about these statistics, there was a study that was done that said 73% of customers believe that receiving a delivery in a convenient time slot is more important than receiving it quickly. Now, I said earlier, Amazon, Walmart, and other competitors are really working on, reducing that lead time to be able to get that to you. But yet perhaps consumers are saying something different. But what we do know is that to be able to do any of that, we're going to have to be able to deploy technology. an overwhelming percent of companies, something like more than 80%, said that they're expecting their spending on software to increase over the next 2 years. We're seeing companies like FedEx and Microsoft start this collaboration where they're going to team up to provide commercial shipping companies with early warnings. That might be delays from weather, traffic, and really other mishaps. And they're going to provide FedEx the software and, as they called it, other weapons that's going to help them compete with Amazon as well. So I'm going to close with this thought. A crisis really challenges our business as usual, and it produces this urgency for change when before, as we said, this idea of prosperity didn't necessarily do that. And I hope I'm speaking for Wendy, and I know that I am, because what we think on the supply side is that this is going to be the encouragement that you need to seize on this opportunity and to really look at the supply chain to do those things that we talked about in terms of reconfiguring, reimagining, and really reconstructing the parts so we do have a lot of resilience. And I'm going to turn it back over to Mary Long now.
Thanks, Mary. Thanks, Wendy. I just want to jump in here with a last poll question, and then I'll hand it back to both of you for a final question. So we know your time is valuable, and we really want to get this exclusive content for you right. So take a moment to answer this question and give us your feedback. These events don't happen with a lot of behind the scenes help. So thanks especially to Hannah, Michelle, and Cole for pulling this together. And of course to Mary and Wendy for leading the discussion and taking us through such rich material for us to think about. Tomorrow, you'll receive an email with the links to the recording and a webinar to the webinar and the recording and the slide deck. Remember that this is a 3-part series. Our final webinar will be on July 28th. It's Gen Z and the Future Workforce, with the speakers being Chad Autry and Cole Burns. So I think Hannah, you can close the poll so that they can see that slide. And be sure to subscribe to our mailing list and follow us on social media to receive future invitations and updates from the Global Supply Chain Institute. Thanks to everyone who participated in our webinar, and let's hear it for Wendy and Mary. And I'm going to hand it back to you two for a final question and your thoughts. Thanks.
Okay, we got quite a few questions, and if you have any, please submit those. And if we don't have the time to get to them before we end this webinar, then we'll certainly try to get some information back to you or post it. But Wendy, one of the questions that we had that was submitted, it talks about has the importance of supplier relationships been increased by the experiences of this disruption? And the follow-on question was, how do you see that this is going to impact governance moving forward? I know you talked about the force majeure. What are your thoughts on this?
So the importance of supply chain relationships with the appropriate suppliers has always been really important in the procurement space. Things have changed, and there are some very creative ways that companies are trying to maintain these relationships, but it's difficult. In some cases, you have companies that, you know, they're stretched, or, you know, they don't have the cash, and so they're trying to look at creative ways to get, you know, supplier financing, just for example, using different fintechs or different ways to access that. But it is very important to maintain particularly your strategic relationships with your strategic suppliers. You need them. I mean, it's hard sometimes to go, how important are the suppliers, but you need them. And we saw, I know in the textile industry, it was terrible. You know, pretty soon hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars of orders were just canceled. What do you expect the suppliers to do? You know, how are they supposed to act in that situation? So yes, it's very important. And yes, I do see that there's going to be changes to governance. I don't think we know what that looks like yet, but as people were, claiming force majeure and all these other things happened, well, who was in the right and who was in the wrong? Hopefully at some point we won't be as we take everybody to court just to solve every kind of problem. So yeah, they're going to change significantly, but they've always been important.
Thank you. So one last question before we end our session today. And this question that was submitted said, the pandemic seems to underscore vulnerabilities that may reside beyond these tier 1 suppliers that you talked about in terms of, know what your network looks like. And the question is, do you anticipate efforts from more companies to pursue visibility and maybe even control beyond their immediate suppliers?
Absolutely, I do. And it's kind of been happening slowly anyway. And there are some companies that are very brand conscious. The one that comes to mind right at the moment is Disney. And Disney has processes in place to manage not just the first tier suppliers. I think they go back 3 tiers of suppliers. So they've got a process in place to do that. The challenge is if you don't have a contract with the supplier, your tier 2 suppliers, you have no contractual relationship, it does make it difficult to measure and manage those different relationships, those multiple tiers. A company that always comes to mind in this multi-tier management is a company called Patagonia. And I'm sure many of you have heard about Patagonia, but their positioning is such that they are sustainable. And so everything about what they do is sustainable. That includes sustainable sourcing and managing multiple tiers of suppliers. The founder of Patagonia will tell you, however, that it is very, very, very difficult to clean up a supply chain, and that you have to go very deep into, multiple tiers to mitigate that risk. And they get in trouble a lot where they have like wool farmers, are abusing the sheep, and that wool is going to Patagonia maybe 4 or 5 tiers later. But the animal rights people will claim that Patagonia has a problem. So we've been working on this, tracking multiple tiers, transparency. Blockchain is being thrown around as a way to improve transparency. I don't know if that's truly the answer, but we've got to figure out where our suppliers are geographically located to better diversify the risk in our supply chain.
Well, thank you, Wendy. It's been my absolute pleasure today to moderate this panel. And as I said, thank you for participating in the webinar today.
Okay, thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you all.
Okay, is that all I had to do? Cross out?